It all comes down to Bill Bengen, who invented the 4% rule. And effectively, it looks at how sustainable income is supposed to be over time. The rule of 375 is a monthly target. And the reason why it's 375 is basically 300 is a 4% rule, but 375 adds in 20% tax. We'll use a £3,000 per month as a rough guide, just because it's kind of an easy thing to consider. So if we use the 4% rule for £3,000 per month, that means you need a pot of £900,000. And that ultimately should, in theory, if the 4% rule holds, give you £3,000 per month regularly. And you should theoretically be able to sustain that over your retirement. It's also adjusted for inflation, so you can adjust that £3,000 per month each year with inflation, and your money shouldn't run out. There is a problem though. Bill didn't consider charges. He didn't also consider taxes. And if we think about the fact that for tax efficiency, you're probably going to have your pension pot as one of the largest elements of your portfolio, we also need to consider taxes. And that's really where the rule of 375 comes in, because the benefit of 375 is it just allows an allowance. It's a very broad allowance, but it allows allowance of 20% tax, because you probably are going to pay tax when you're drawing down your assets. So then if we look at that £3,000 per month and we throw it into the rule of 375, it gives us a pot of 1,125,000. So you can see quite a difference from the 900,000 on the 4% rule. And that really speaks to the fact that we do need to be mindful of the impact of tax in retirement and how that's going to impact things. There are other considerations around it. We have things like the state pension. You might have other income sources. But again, if these are just broad guidelines, it gives you an idea. And just to clarify, when I say £3,000 per month, that's what you'll be spending ultimately. So when I'm saying about the pot sizes, that's what you need invested so that you can spend £3,000 per month.
So the one thing I was thinking about with these rules is the shift in spending over time. Mm-hmm. So if I'd done that number in my 20s and I look at that now, my first ever job was 15 grand a year.
Yeah.
I spend more than that now, like gross on the living costs in the house over, say, a few month period.
Yeah.
So there's been this monumental shift in my spending over a 10 to 15 year period.
Yeah.
How are people accommodating for that then?
I think all you can do is adjust as you go, because the thing is, life is going to change. When you're in your 20s, you basically will have probably, especially if you're living at home, you'll have very limited outgoings. But obviously what tends to happen for a lot of people over time is you accumulate things like mortgages, kids, dogs, all the rest of it.
Just keep collecting.
Yeah, just keep collecting.
Got them all.
And that's going to be so wildly different. So the reason why these things are just guidelines is your life is going to change so much over time, which is kind of the key thing. I think when you're doing the calculation, one thing I would say is that you've got to track and adapt over time. That's kind of the fundamental thing, because your life in your 30s, it's not going to be anything like that your life's going to be like in your 60s. And there were probably going to be some drop-offs. Like a lot of people ideally would like to have cleared their mortgage, ideally not be paying rent in retirement. Those things need to take into consideration. There's also the other things as well which throw it out, like we're going to have the state pension in payment as well. So you can't just be thinking, well, I'm not probably going to just have my income from my investments. I'm probably going to have other income there to consider as well. The one thing, because I know we've discussed this previously, the one thing that it is useful to do is if you are going to use these calculations, make sure you're using inflation adjusted growth rates. Mm-hmm. So for example, some people, one of the most common things you see out and about in sort of finance YouTube world is people kind of be like, oh, it's a 10% return per annum. And that's because they basically used typically like 1970s S&P 500. Well, the reality of the matter is if you're using that as your compounded growth rate and then expecting to be able to spend down on that, you're not factoring in that inflation over that time is going to be 3% or whatever. So you need to really consider using the inflation adjusted returns, which are much more realistic, around 5.5, depending on your time series and what set of data you're looking at.
So if you bang 5% into the compound interest calculator, what you're saying is that the pot that you end up with, the big number, is adjusted for inflation. So it's kind of, actually, when you arrive at the destination, the pot value will be bigger. That's the nominal value, but it will have the purchasing power to some degree protected.
Yeah, correct. Because otherwise what happens is because our human brains, just all of us, we're not very good at working out exponentials and compounded in our mind. It's really hard to grab your head around. So if you don't factor in inflation within that bit of the calculation, you're kind of effectively having to take it away then at a later stage. So it's better just to neutralize it in your growth rate, is my view. The only thing just with that 5% growth rate is that that's actually a quite reasonable assumption for 100% equity, and not everyone else is in 100% equity. So if anything, it does kind of speak to the importance. If you have a look at bonds, they're kind of, when you look at kind of the 100-year run, they're much closer to 2.5 after inflation. So it speaks to the importance of something that I know you've been a massive advocate of, which is making sure that you're looking at your fund that you're invested in, make sure it's aligned to your goals, whether it's long-term goals, short-term or medium-term.
Where's your buzzer?
Yeah, I was about to say, where's my buzzer? I was going to go bzzz and be like, someone's nicked my buzzer.
2 jobs, William. We always need the buzzer, we always need the release forms, and we need feeding. Hey, there we go, get the buzzer in. Because when you said, you said something, and I was like,
yeah. And I was like,
I was going to ask you the question, I was going to be like, Tremaine, question for you, where the fuck's your buzzer? Okay, so and just on those 2 numbers as well, I think it helps to have both, because one thing that I think might happen as well, a risk, is someone bases it on 5% and goes, okay, I need £1 million. They hit £1 million in their mid-40s and go, oh, yes, I did it, sorry. I did it. And they don't realise, oh no, it's inflation adjusted again. Yeah. You kind of want like both numbers at all points. So, this is the big goal, but that's what it actually means in spending power.
I think you're 100% right. And I also think it really speaks to just how difficult it is to get your head around inflation and the impact of it. So I had a look at some kind of Hargreaves Lansdown kind of inflation calculator. And over the last 5 years, if you look at RPI, it's been over 30%. It's been like 34% or something like that.
Sorry, what's RPI?
Retail Price Index.
There you go.
It's a slightly higher measure of inflation than what the Bank of England use, which is
better quality. It includes housing, doesn't it?
Well, there's still loads of stuff it doesn't include.
Yeah.
But I think it's the better one to use if you're going to use an assumption, because it's closer to the real cost, as you say. It includes housing.
They used to use it, and then they scrapped it when they realised it wasn't that great. Then they went CPI.
And also a lot of the government kind of pension increases used to be linked to, or certain increases used to be linked to RPI as well.
And it tends to be higher because it includes the housing components. But it's more reflective of like what people might call their actual basket of goods.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think what tends to happen, because I'm really guilty for this, is that you think about this when you think about your own salary. Like, you always anchor back to what it was like 5-10 years ago, didn't you? I was having this conversation the other day, and it's kind of like when we look at our salaries, we kind of think, oh yeah, well that's good money, and you're probably anchoring to a figure 5 years ago and thinking, yeah, that's okay. But then actually when you go out and try and use the purchasing power for that money, you go, oh, everything's so damn expensive. Yeah. Why is my water so high? So it's absolutely essential to not only look at your personal inflation rate, which is basically the amount that you're spending and how much that's kind of increased. Now, you don't necessarily have to do a calculation for this, but just have a look at your expenditure and try and keep track of it. And that'll give you a guide of how much it's gone up. And that's the crucial thing that you need to really be looking at for retirement planning, because it's absolutely fine to use broad figures when you're building up money, building up your assets and so forth. But when it comes to coming down the mountain and retiring, you really need to have a hand on your personal finances, because you don't want to retire and then be in a position where you look back in 3-5 years and go, oh no, I actually need way more money than I thought.
That was a clip from our chat with George Agan, financial advisor. To watch the whole thing, click right here. What are you doing? What did you do? What did you do? What did you do?
Smiled.